Welcome to the Where Mindset Meets Movement podcast, where we explore the connection between training the body and strengthening the mind to help people move, recover, and perform at their best. I'm Brendan Copley, and this is my co-host, Dr. Zach Hanaki.
And today we are going to explore the psychology of comebacks. So, Brendan, I actually think today's conversation, we have a unique opportunity to start by exploring an experience that you've had recently. Last year, you had planned to compete in a Hyrox competition. People may or may not know about you that you were a collegiate runner, but you are just a lifelong athlete and enthusiast in exercise. And so, as many people who are of your profile, I think, have been exploring recently, wanted to see what this Hyrox thing was all about. And I remember that you were really serious about your training regimen and getting very close to the competition, and you had a really major setback. So would you be willing to share a little bit about kind of what happened and what the consequences were of that setback for you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so Hyrox was something I'd been training for probably about like 6 months of a training block. Just been building up. It was probably the best shape that I was in my entire life, I would say, because you're combining both the strength and the cardiovascular fitness. And yeah, about 6 weeks before, ended up rupturing my appendix and had to have an emergency appendectomy, which totally derailed everything. There was a point in time where white blood cells were super, super high, and they were like, geez, is this guy gonna go into sepsis kind of thing?
Oh, wow.
It was really not a good situation. But thankfully, appendicitis is a reasonably common thing. And they had a good surgeon there, and my actual surgery went smoothly. But then, for the next 6 weeks, I was not able to lift anything more than 10 pounds. So for someone that went from best shape of their life to all of a sudden not being able to lift anything, that was a pretty quick 180-degree turn in my life.
Yeah, that's, it's not like getting the flu when you're out for a couple of weeks. Like, essentially, the limitations that come after the surgery completely derail your process. And I would imagine you feel like you're starting over, or even maybe starting in the negative in some ways. So could you talk a bit about emotionally what it was like to have to grapple with this realization that I've dedicated all this time and energy into this goal that I have? I have, endured a lot of like pain and suffering and sacrifice to get to this point. And now, right as I'm about to sort of reap the rewards of that, that's ripped away from me. Like, what was that like for you, and how did you cope with that?
Yeah. That was tough. That was really, dark days, those next couple of weeks, not just because of the goal that I had set out and all of that hard work, but also my employment as a personal trainer. You're consistently lifting weights in order to help set up for clients, and just part of your day-to-day is incredibly active. So there was moments of time of like, okay, how am I even going to make money for myself and, support my family and whatnot. So there was definitely some dark times of sort of, fear of what's next. There was reevaluation of identity. Obviously, huge part of my identity is sport and athleticism and being the guy that's, in great shape, and even also, the physical attributes aspect of things of not being able to lift. Obviously there's always aesthetic goals with looking a certain way, and if you can't even lift weights, then your body changes totally. So working with sort of the frustrations and the sadness around and all of that.
We're going to get here, or we're going to get there at some point, but you made a really good comeback, and you competed in the Hyrox competition this year. So you obviously were able to navigate that. Could you talk about, were there any sort of concrete examples of moments where you were unsure that you'd be able to get back to that point? Are there any examples that you can think of sort of your darkest moments where you felt like, I don't know who I am anymore, or I don't feel like I'm the same athlete that I once was. I'll never get back to that level. Did you experience anything like that, along the way to getting back to a point where you're able to complete that competition?
Yeah, I don't think it was everything like that dark, but it was definitely, the moment that they told me that I had appendicitis, my mind immediately just went to the fact that I was definitely never going to be able to race again. I will say, having had a number of injuries in college as well as in high school through training, I felt like I had the capacity to come back from things, and that sort of inner belief in myself definitely helped some of those darker times. But I will say I did, rely heavily on my fiance Jen and the people that were around me for, immense amount of support. And I'd say the first couple weeks were the hardest, where you're in so much pain and you're like in discomfort, even with the simplest things like getting out of bed and going for a walk, and really, really basic things. It can be incredibly humbling, but knowing that that's part of the process, and that the surgery went okay, are definitely gratifying things. The other two big things that were setbacks, that were challenging to work through, was I had an umbilical hernia that they had repaired when they were in there, but pretty soon into the recovery, it actually popped again. And that definitely changed my ability to brace my core. And there were some challenges that came from that also limited my ability to lift and, maneuver things as a result of that. And then the other one that was particularly tricky was 2 weeks before actually 2026, after I had fully healed, fully recovered. I had injured my back 2 weeks before, not the first Hyrox, but the second Hyrox that I was training for.
I remember.
And just how frustrating that was to sort of have moments of doubt of, oh my gosh, am I just never going to be able to do this again? I've allocated not just 6 months, but I've allocated pretty much 1.5 years of my life to this one race. And, it also too, it wasn't just the race. It wasn't just completing it. I was training really to race like as fast as I possibly could too.
Right.
I had done a number of simulations where I knew that I could complete the race, but it was more a matter of how fast. And so this was just like, oh man, I proved to myself that I can do it, but man, this is really dramatically hindering my goal of doing it at the time that I wanted, and all those different things.
Well, and to me, I think that gives us an opportunity to take this in a couple of important directions, but there's an overarching theme I hear to what you just said, which is that sometimes there's a disconnect between your expectations for what the process is going to look like as you're returning from an injury or a setback, and how it actually is. And I think this, for many athletes, including the ones that I work with in the mental performance space, is one of the largest obstacles, which is, all right, I'm hurt. I've come to terms with that. I have a plan for what it's going to look like for me to recover. And then I get hurt in another way, or I don't feel like I'm progressing at the rate that I expected. And how much of an obstacle that can be mentally to then motivating yourself to continue. So how did you navigate that feeling of, oh, maybe I don't know if I can achieve the goal that I had set out in performing as well as I want to here, or what if I did all this rehabilitation process and I can't perform? I remember, we talked the day before the performance in 2026 this year, and you're like, I don't know if I'll finish or not.
Yeah.
So could you talk a bit about how you were able to work through those feelings and manage your expectations and ultimately, do what you're able to do?
Yeah. So I think starting from a place of like normalizing the fact that it was okay that I was frustrated, and like that was a pretty normal reaction to that, and then taking some time to reflect on that, and then really trying to prioritize like where I was spending my attention, and making sure that I wasn't letting it distract from me from the things that I actually could control. So with that 2 weeks leading up, I still was, trying to not let it distract me from, I had my bachelor party that next week. So I
Yep.
wanted to make sure that I was still connecting with friends and, making sure that my mood was not impacting who I was as a person. And having a bunch of friends around supporting you and having fun definitely is a great way of distracting you from a race looming in the distance. Not the best recovery tool.
But you wouldn't be surprised to hear that Brendan did have a group of us do a run on the first day of the bachelor party.
Of course.
No surprises there. You mentioned normalization. I think that's really a powerful point that you made. Normalizing how I feel, normalizing the abnormality or the randomness of the process of recovery. How does normalizing that help you navigate that moment?
Yeah. So I would say for me, it made it okay so that the emotions as they did pop up, they didn't overwhelm me. They didn't distract me from, the other things that I wanted to focus on. For example, even on the day of the race, I got really emotional, and I definitely was like crying in front of my parents to just sort of like, I couldn't believe that I was there. It was just a really powerful moment for me to hear the music that was playing, to see some of the athletes go by, and to normalize that, know that that was like an okay emotion, that I was nervous, I was excited, I was all of the feels. But then I still took a moment to sort of recenter before the race. And when the race actually started, I feel like I was pretty good at still just focusing on what I needed to focus on, trying to bring my heart rate down, try to stay, because I had a back injury, I was trying to neutralize my spine as much as I could and focus on form, focus on strategy, all the things that I had mentally prepared myself for, so that intense emotion of, everything didn't overwhelm my ability to perform on the day of.
Could you share a little bit about how it went, what the experience was like for you competing, and were there any mental strategies you employed that you felt like were particularly helpful in having what seemed to be a overwhelmingly positive experience?
Yeah. Boy, I feel like a big part of it all was honestly just this like inner monologue of just keep pushing forward and just like focus on the next step, like next step, like, and keep asking myself the question of, could I do, one more station? Could I do one more step? Could I do one more? And really breaking it down to like its simplest of movements and simplest of moments. So after the ski erg, which is the first station of the Hyrox, I was in first in the group that I was racing against, but I knew that after I'd first done that station that my back didn't feel quite right. And I was really worried that the rest of the stations were going to completely blow up. But I really just like slowly started jogging. I slowly just sort of started moving through the rest of that run and then entered into the sled push. And by the time I got to sled push, things had kind of calmed down a little bit. So I feel like for me, it was just continuously recentering and really just focusing on like the smaller portions in time instead of looking at the entire race and thinking like, holy crap, I still have, an hour and how much more time in this heat and with this amount of pain. I don't know if it's possible. Instead, just breaking it down to smaller and smaller sections.
Do you feel like that process of recentering is a way to combat the mind sort of taking itself to what if this goes wrong? What if I don't feel good on the next section? What if my back starts to tighten up? I feel like you're someone who's above average at being mindful and being present and taking an inventory of kind of what's happening, and that there's a value in that when it comes to overcoming mental obstacles. So, could you talk a bit about sort of how you feel like that recentering process allows you to avoid allowing those thoughts about the future get in the way of what you're trying to do in the moment?
Yeah. So it definitely comes with practice too. This isn't something that like all of a sudden I woke up one day and was like, geez, I'm going to all of a sudden be able to have this amazing capacity to just stay present, stay with the moment, and just meditate
It's
at
the
all
only
times.
version I've ever known of you. So,
This is something that I feel like has been, having a daily practice so that it's of meditation and mindfulness practice that's allowed me to stay a little bit more present in those more extreme circumstances, and calling back from past experiences of doing similar things and then therefore having more confidence. So for example, like in the race, this for the Hyrox, it was extremely hot. And there was a moment of time of like, I don't think I can continue at this pace without completely blowing up my race. And that's a huge part. And no matter what Hyrox you're in, a lot of times people go out incredibly fast.
Yeah.
And there was a moment of recognition relatively early on the race, and that allowed me to back off a little bit and therefore I think hold a little bit more of a stable time. And I had a very similar moment actually in Florida, which is where our conference championship was for cross country. And it was a race where we're actually racing against Iona, and now we're at Iona doing a podcast, which is wonderful. But we were racing against Iona, which is one of the top teams in the conference, and our initial strategy was to stay with Iona. And we had gone out incredibly fast, and we're used to racing in northern New England, which is relatively temperate temperatures compared to hot Florida, and we hadn't done any acclimation period. So all of a sudden, we're in this race where it's incredibly hot, and we've gone out way too fast. And some of the people that were on my team, I think, were able to recognize that this was too hot, and myself included in that group, and we were able to back off that strategy and change the overall pace of that day in order to still perform at our best. And there were some people that didn't do as well with that, but I think the people that were able to throw the game plan away and all of a sudden reflect and be present with what was going on that day, and in that moment, and pivot and be flexible, were the ones that were most successful on that day within that team, and then did the same thing in Hyrox.
That reminds me a lot. We talked about last episode psychological flexibility, and to me that's a great example of utilizing psychological flexibility, and being present, being mindful allows you to seep through the emotions in a way that doesn't allow them to co-opt your ability to pivot, right? And so I think you speak really well to that. In many cases, athletes, when they realize that things are not going the way that they expected them to, they panic and think, wow, this is bad. They assign judgment to it. And the problem with that, I think, as you articulated, is then that you're not able to access, well, what do we do now? And I think you did a good job of pointing out that for some teammates, they were able to say, okay, like this was the wrong game plan. Can't do anything about that now. Time to move on. And if you can be non-emotional about that, it makes it a lot more accessible to then ask yourself the question of what else can I control that could improve the circumstance for me in the future. So along those lines, like, are there other tools or are there other lessons that you feel like you learned, or maybe you just were able to utilize in a unique way throughout this journey of the Hyrox experience, either navigating the initial return to sport or navigating the competition itself, that you feel like are particularly important to share?
Yeah, I would say the only other thing that I have that's relevant here would be just like how you're navigating your fear, and making sure that you're, throughout your training progressions, that you're taking that into account, and then therefore progressing in a way that's connected to where your psychological state is, so that you're not making too big of jumps in where your actual recovery process is, both mentally and physically. So like for the example of the Hyrox, there's definitely, for me and my own recovery from the appendix, there were definitely times where I, immediately wanted to hop right back into, sled pushing and doing wall balls and doing these heavier movement patterns. But I knew that my core strength wasn't quite there, and I needed to make sure that the progressions were incredibly gradual and in sync with the actual recovery process versus making those big jumps, and not just physically but also mentally. If I wasn't mentally prepared and if I didn't fully believe that I was ready for whatever that next progression was, then I figured that physiologically the body was not going to respond as well too, or there'd be tension in areas that probably shouldn't be, or apprehension for that next step.
That actually, I think, sets us up well to pivot a bit. Your background is unique in that not only are you a personal trainer, and so you help people, whether they're athletes or maybe former athletes or just people who prioritize exercising, daily movement, etc., but you also have a background in athletic training, and so you are uniquely familiar with the body and its physiology and return to sport protocols. So I imagine that you are helping on a daily basis your clientele navigate return to sport, navigate nagging pains and aches and injuries. What are some of the common issues that you see people face when it comes to return to sport, or maybe best practices that you feel like people need to be more aware of when it comes to navigating the process of coming back from a setback or an injury?
Yeah, I'll take those in two different questions. The first one being like common things that I try to do and try to set in stone is, one, getting to know the client both mentally and physically. So doing a really thorough evaluation in both their injury, their strength, their mobility, and trying to get a sense of where they're at from a physiological healing standpoint, so that the specific exercises that you're providing are well matched with their tolerance level, load, everything. From a mental standpoint, also getting to know the athlete and understanding, what their goals are, what their hopes are, what they're really steering their training for, because that also then leads to you providing exercises or manual therapy, whatever it may be, that helps steer them towards those very specific goals. Additionally, one of the perks of both in athletic training and in personal training is that you get to know the clients that you're working with incredibly well. Like, there was definitely times where in the athletic training room, an athlete would come up and I would ask them how they are, and depending on not what they said, because pretty much everyone always says, "Oh yeah, I'm good," but their body language and understanding just them as a person, and all of their just what makes them them, allows you to then tweak that training program on that given day, because ultimately there's going to be bumps in the road and ebbs and flows, and being able to ride that with your client and understand that it's not going to be all linear, that you just have to make sure that you're staying consistent with the things that you can and adapting when there's setbacks, and trying to heal appropriately. Yeah, go ahead.
I know from my own work too that when you work with people for such prolonged periods of time, you get to see them when things are challenging, and then that makes the breakthroughs that much more rewarding. Can you think of any examples of people that you've worked with that have had that moment where you're like, oh, this is awesome. I'm so proud of them for being able to navigate this or finally get over this hump, and maybe share a bit about, what characterizes the people that are able to do that, or what gets them to those moments.
Yeah. I actually was thinking about this for a while when we were coming up with the topic for today's podcast, and I think there is a little bit of an underarching theme. And what I identified was such a important positive quality for the people that were able to make progressions, specifically in those that had either chronic pain or chronic illness, because I think that's an area that we don't really talk quite enough. I feel like in the athletic training world, or even in the personal training world, I feel like a lot of times we look at these scenarios and we think, okay, somebody had an ACL tear, they're following this very specific protocol, or they had a ankle sprain and they're following, this very specific 4-week return to sport program. But we don't talk about the people that had Lyme disease and they had a lot of misdiagnoses before they finally were able to find the doctor that pointed them in the right direction and got them the appropriate medicine, or they've had chronic pain for so long and in reality they really needed maybe they're hypermobile and they needed some strengthening, but have been so fear avoidant because they've been in pain for so long. So I think that the common thread between all of the chronic pain, chronic illness, for the people that have been injured or in pain for a year and been told by a number of people that it's in your head or whatever, that these people consistently believed that their current situation was not right, that it wasn't enough, that they were in so much pain that, and everyone else had told them that, it was nothing, it was whatever. But they stayed consistently optimistic about the idea that they could improve. And that then led to them finding either the right strength program or the right person that led them into the right direction, or it was a number of different things, but it was this consistent optimism or belief that what they were going through, it wasn't right. And it forced them to stay determined to believe that they really could improve.
I can tell, like, just looking at you, how the impact that those people have made, like being able to witness their journey and be a part of it. And it is inspiring. That's the word that I'm looking for. Where do you think that comes from, or what can we learn from people who are able to navigate really difficult circumstances like chronic pain, where the answer is unclear, where you don't know if you'll ever feel 100% again? Is there anything that we can take away from those people that, even if we're not suffering from something as severe, might help improve our ability to navigate the little obstacles that we face on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just your belief in yourself. Like if you really are noticing that you have a direction in your life that you want to go, that you're capable of so much. And that sounds so cliche and so cheesy, but like you really can do what you put your mind to. And sometimes it takes, somebody else helping you to realize what you are capable of. But continuing to stay curious, I think, is a big part of it. Like being able to, whatever you are driven towards being able to do, to stay curious on how you're going to be able to achieve that goal. Because sometimes it ends up, you find the answers in places you wouldn't expect to necessarily find them. But if you're staying open to how you want to be able to recover from a chronic knee injury or something like that, or and not even that, but if you feel like you are stuck in a rut for a long time, just continue to stay curious, continue to surround yourself by people that want to help you, and know that, you're malleable. A lot of things are really workable and you have potential to change.
That concept of curiosity is one that I find myself working with in the mental performance space often, in part because of the nonlinear nature of improvement, of progress, of overcoming obstacles. And I think sometimes it helps to conceptualize things in terms of, like, if I told you that I knew in a year that you would be where you wanted to be, would you be willing to accept that the next 6 months are going to be worse than you anticipated?
Yeah.
Or would you be willing to accept that you would take a step back before you took a step forward? Oftentimes it's so hard to access that in our mind because we're just so caught up in what is currently happening is what's going to continue to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think the ingredient that allows us to get out of that cycle is that non-judgmental curiosity, that willingness to say, okay, well, this isn't what I expected, but what is happening and what can I learn from this? And I think that that's a really extraordinary insight into the experiences that you're seeing your clients sort of navigate.
And I think similarly, to have a curiosity in yourself, I think some of the best clinicians are probably also the ones that are the most curious about their patients or their clients. If they consistently are checking in and reevaluating, whether that's reevaluating their strength, reevaluating their range of motion, and really getting to know this person that they're working with at a really, really high level, they're going to, one, empathize with their situation at a much deeper level, And that's going to lead to a deeper knowledge than I would say, Joe Schmo that's just looking up something on ChatGPT and sending it over and being like, okay, good luck, follow these things and you're good. I feel like the roadblocks that I've seen in myself, the times where I feel like I've been the most frustrated with treating clients have been the scenarios where I think I already had it figured out. And as soon as I reevaluated, I realized, oh, there was this one small, I haven't looked at their ankle yet. Why didn't I look at their ankle? They actually have this limitation in dorsiflexion or ankle motion that's dramatically changing their whole squat form. And then that led to, the change in their rehabilitation plan.
Can you talk a bit about your process in that sense? Because I also find myself reflecting on the fact that, you enter into work like the work that we do, even though it's a little different, but we still kind of have similar objectives. We're trying to help people perform and feel good about what they're doing. And you quickly learn, I think, that if you think there's a cookie cutter approach to anybody, you're going to be disappointed. That you have to sort of enter into this work with a bunch of tools and a willingness to figure out what works for the individual, and take that time. So, what does that process look like for you, sort of assessing that with your clients, being able to pivot if you feel like the original plan isn't working? Can you speak at all to that process?
Yeah, I would say in simply put, if it's a new evaluation, I'm trying to get to know their overall goals, injury history, their specific previous experiences they've had with personal trainers or other healthcare providers that they either want to re-include or that they really want to avoid. But goals are a huge part of it. Trying to get a sense of where they want to go very specifically guides your next phases. Then trying to get a sense of their range of motion, their strength, their functional movement patterns. So understanding both on the table how their hip range of motion is, then segmenting with their functional movement patterns like their squat, their lunge, their hip hinge, so on and so forth. And then evaluating their actual strength, trying to get a sense of how strong they are and set a baseline so that you're able to give a more specific workout or exercise plan that steers them towards their goals. Ultimately.
Speaking of goals, because I feel like that's really important when it comes to coming back from anything, right? You have something to strive for. Otherwise, why put yourself through all of that? It's really hard to be hurt and deal with pain and not know if you'll ever be the same again, and then motivate yourself to do all this work just to get back to baseline. Do you ever find yourself having to work with clients on reevaluating either the appropriateness of their goals in general, or maybe the timeline that they have set for themselves around their goals? Like, what is that balance like?
That's a tough one, because especially if you think that their goals are unrealistic, because I feel like it's really hard as a client to potentially hear that what they have as far as a timeline is unrealistic. You always want to be told yes, 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 and have that continue to motivate you. I find that it's probably easier to, especially if it's a newer client, to initially just get started with the program, and they'll get a sense of pretty quickly of how they're progressing, and then have it be something that the client then brings up, where they're giving a specific example of, hey, it's been 6 weeks and I'm not chest pressing 300 pounds when I started at 15. What the heck's going on? And then if they're leading that conversation, then I can fall back on a little bit more of the specific physiological evidence behind, how it takes 6 to 8 weeks of building neuromuscular control. Then you start to see, muscle hypertrophy after this phase. And here's a more realistic progression that I think better matches your needs. I think the opposite is probably an easier conversation, where if they think that if their goals are below what you think that they're capable of, that I think is where it's more fun to have a conversation around that you the practitioner, or you the clinician could lead and say, hey, I actually think that you're capable of so much more than what you are thinking that you are, and then give specific evidence too of gradual, progressions of what their strength is or what their mobility is, and show them that, actually you are incredibly strong and you can, run X pace and you didn't even realize it. But I think that you're capable of a lot more.
What I want to come back to something you said at the beginning of that question that I actually think is even maybe a better question, which is, what role do you play or should practitioners play in helping educate clients on the expectations that they have or on the physiology? It sounds, when I hear you talk about it, I'm guessing there are people in the audience that are like, I've never had my personal trainer explain to me like this is muscle hypertrophy and it's going to take this amount of time to see adaptation, and here are some of the setbacks you might anticipate. And that's normal, and this is why it's going to be okay. How important is that? What is your role in doing that? What impact do you think that has on helping people to really maximize the training that they're receiving?
Yeah, I think it's imperative. I think it's such an important part of, especially for the recovery process.
Right.
If you have an injury when you have very unrealistic concepts of when you think you're going to be pain-free by, those are definitely important conversations to come back to physiological healing time. When's the acute phase, when's the intermediate phase, when's the more of the recovery phase, so on and so forth. And then definitely the more opportunities that you have to educate without sounding like you're mansplaining on a certain anatomical or physiological concept, probably the better, especially if you're able to break it down in very layman's terms. I find that a lot of people are pretty visual also with their injuries or with their musculature, and like providing good visuals for whatever is injured, like for the shoulder joint, being able to explain and show a visual of impingement or something like that can help them really conceptualize where their pain points are, and then also what the musculature that you're trying to reintroduce and retrain, it can be incredibly important.
Along those lines of just how complex this process is of coming back from a setback and the individual differences, we had this conversation a little bit prior off mic as well. How important is a team in this process? Obviously, like, everyone's going to have different resources available to them, but like, who are the important people that can support people in their return to sport or navigating injuries and setbacks? Who do you work with? What do you do when you don't have all the answers?
Mm-hmm.
All of the above. Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think I can break this down in a couple different ways. Like, for example, in the athletic training room, if you're college and maybe even sometimes a high school athletic trainer, the people that are in your network are, you have usually a sports psychologist, a physician, a nutritionist, and sometimes even you refer out for, or sometimes you have in your college as well too, like a PT, a chiropractor, those types of people in your allied healthcare team, essentially. And then outside of a college system, it's probably, from myself right now, I definitely have PTs, osteopaths, physicians, psychologists, nutritionists. I try to have a similar team as in that athletic training room as I would outside of outside of that college. I think the most important thing though is to try to get to know some of those providers on a more personal level as well too, so that you know their personality, their demeanor, what athletes or individuals would work well with those people, so that it's a more educated referral. So like, ultimately your goal as a provider is to help the people that you're with. And I think it's an important skill set to know what's outside of your scope of practice just as much as you need to know what's inside your scope. So knowing and having a team around you, I think, is imperative, because there's so many aspects of your care for someone that are most likely outside of the scope of a personal trainer, but also similarly outside of the scope of a nutritionist, or similarly outside of the scope of a psychologist. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. I had an opportunity at the beginning of the year to present to a group of therapists, like mental health practitioners whose focus is on treating things like depression and anxiety
Mm.
and on the athletic mental performance space. And one of the big ideas I drove home at the end of the presentation was this is when we refer to you, because it's really important for us in our space to recognize the things that are within our scope of practice, the things that are outside of our scope of practice.
Yeah.
And if you really care about the people that you're working with, it's not about maximizing clients, it's not about maximizing dollars, it's just about figuring out what's going to help them. So I think that starts with knowing when you don't know all the answers and sending them to the right places. To kind of close a loop on all of this, you had your personal experience with coming back. You've obviously helped many of your own clients navigate the comeback process. Are there a few major takeaways that you feel like someone who's struggling, someone who's feeling stuck, someone who's trying to navigate an injury, that you would want them to know about that process, and take with them to help them kind of have that moment that you were referring to earlier, where you get to see someone who is able to show themselves that they're capable of more than they even realized?
Mm-hmm. I think probably the simplest way for me to break that down is just to sort of recap some of the things that I've touched on already.
Yeah.
So recapping that specific moment, I definitely touched on staying curious and having a really optimistic belief in your capability to progress. And at times that you are feeling your lowest, I think it's hard to be optimistic, but the curiosity might eventually lead you to people that will help point you in the right direction there. Other things that I think are relevant is sometimes your confidence might not happen before the actual event, that it actually happens after the event. So for example, I wasn't particularly confident going into the Hyrox that I was going to hit the time that I was going to hit. I was pretty uncertain. But now going through that concept or going through that race, I feel way more confident that I am resilient, that I am, able to recover from, immense amount of discomfort, and setback and so on and so forth. But that confidence didn't come until afterwards, which I think is a confusing part, because a lot of people would find that the reason that you were successful for that Hyrox was, you were so confident going into it. I don't think that was the case at all. I think maybe there was some element in belief in myself because of previous experiences, but there was a huge amount of uncertainty as well too, and that's okay. Sometimes it's just enough to just do the thing and then believe in yourself nevertheless, and then you can be resilient and confident afterwards.
I often tell athletes that there is no substitute for actually doing something when it comes to confidence. Like,
yeah.
I'm not a big there's a lot of different ways to support your confidence, but I often will tell athletes, I'm like, look, like standing in the mirror and telling yourself you're awesome is only going to take you so far. You have to see success, but these are the things that increase the probability of that.
Yeah.
And then once you show yourself that, then that's something you can rely on in the future. And then when that happens, that's real, that's tangible. It's not you just lying to yourself or trying to convince yourself of something. I wanted to ask you about just one more concept that I think it's in what you've been talking about, which is a concept of self-compassion. When you are coming back from an injury and things are not going the way that you want them to, I often find athletes or non-athletes have a tendency to make a false equivalency between, if I say that it's okay that today I'm not at my best, or that I am not hitting my goal, that I'm not holding myself to a high enough standard, and I can't achieve the things that I wanted to achieve. And in your journey, you were simultaneously balancing these high goals.
Yep.
You never abandoned them. And also, it sounded like a number of moments where you were not where you wanted to be. And so do you think that compassion played a role in helping you get through that?
Definitely. I think that's an important part of the healing process, is sort of recognizing your current state and being compassionate towards yourself. And then I think it pretty quickly was switched though into trying to build out identity and make sure that, I was focusing on other things other than just that, like, compassion towards that one goal, and then, okay, let me redirect myself and my identity towards other things.
Do you want to share a little bit about that to finish up, like the way you were able to grab onto other aspects of your identity to help you navigate that process?
Yeah, so I think it when I was working with some of my athletes at Quinnipiac, I would use this sort of wheel of performance, and in that wheel, it talks about a wide variety of other skill sets that are unrelated to your sort of your physical traits, like your mobility, your strength, those types of things, and it touches on, how are you doing in your career, your relationships, your time management, your overall confidence, your, these less tangible pieces, and then grades them, 1 to 10. And I think sometimes maybe the grading system is helpful for some people, not helpful for others. But I think having a greater sense of identity and focusing on those other things is incredibly important. For me, we shortly afterwards went on a vacation to Florida and spent Easter there. So focusing on my relationship with my family, my friends, it was, focusing on, because I wasn't able to do some of the physical pieces of personal training, I concentrated a little bit more on the management side of things. And I was working at a clinic where I had the opportunities to focus on growing business and growing the team as a whole versus just concentrating on what physically I needed to do for my job and my role there, and so on and so forth.
There's a therapeutic technique called dialectic behavior therapy. And one of the basic premises of dialectic behavior therapy is the concept of dialectics. And a dialectic is essentially being able to hold in mind two seemingly contradictory concepts simultaneously. And I think that's pretty relevant. And it's part of why I think what you just described is effective when it comes to grabbing onto other aspects of your identity, that you can both care a lot about your goal in the athletic realm, and also you can value your identity in other areas of life. And you are not taking away from one by anchoring onto another. What you're doing is just giving yourself perspective and allowing the pressure that you feel to be the right amount for you. And so I think that that's very well supported in the research in this domain. So not surprising that you did that and you found it to be effective.
I will say too, though, like, this sounds pretty like high and mighty of me to be able to do all these things, but I feel like if this were to have happened to me when I was in college, I actually think it would have been a completely different scenario. And I don't think I would have recovered as well mentally. I would say in college, a much bigger portion of my identity was around sport. I was on scholarship. That was a huge part of why I was there at Quinnipiac, and all of my friends were associated with that. I can definitely see how in college that is like a microcosm of identity crises when people get injured there, because of just how intertwined their identity is. I think looking back on it now, I could say that if I had the same thought process and mindset as I do now, I probably still would have been okay, because I would have still worked to, build those relationships. But this is the concept of spreading out your identity is something that I feel like comes with age a little bit, and also hard work too. It took time and effort, and also me just removing myself from college in order to be able to improve in that capacity.
Yeah, I think it's important for practitioners who are trying to help people navigate exploring the multiple elements of their identity to have that empathy, to that recognition that, if I'm a 35-year-old former athlete, that's a different place in life than a 18-year-old who everything up to that point has been focused on achieving in that domain. But also, I think part of the reason that we started the podcast is because we both look back on that time in our careers and say, there are some things I wish I had known. And hopefully, with the benefit of hindsight, we can pass some of that knowledge on. Yeah. So, do you have any final thoughts that you want to pass along regarding this comeback topic that we've covered today?
Yeah, I think just recapping once again some of the things that we've already talked about, just to put it all in one place, could be helpful. So we talked about the importance of curiosity and how that can then stimulate your belief and your capacity to be optimistic around a scenario and continue to grow and improve. And we talked about the nonlinear aspect of your overall journey especially from injuries, but also other setbacks as well too. We talked about that confidence is sometimes retroactive versus proactive, that sometimes it's beneficial to just do the thing and see where that brings you out. And then I think lastly is just sort of understanding that fear and some of the emotions that come up with injury are really normal part of the process, and making sure that your progressions within your overall recovery are appropriately matched for both your physical and your mental state for that. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Brendan.
Yeah. Do you want to introduce the potential next episode?
I would.
If you enjoyed this podcast, and keep listening, because our next episode is...
We are going to be talking about motivation.
Ooh.
And the things that athletes can lean on and non-athletes can lean on to support motivation, and even some of the misnomers or mistakes about motivation. So I'm very excited to dig into that topic with you next.
I'm pretty excited too. That should be a good one.